Germany was supposed to be the blueprint for the future. For 2 decades, the world watched as the continent's industrial titan embarked on the most ambitious engineering pivot in modern history, the energy went. This was more than just a policy change. It was a $500 billion bet that a high-tech, heavy industry economy could decouple itself from the volatile world of fossil fuels and the perceived risks of nuclear power. The vision was seductive, a landscape of sleek white turbines and shimmering solar arrays powering the world's most efficient factories. It was a promise of energy sovereignty, environmental purity, and economic dominance. But today, that vision has collided with the cold, unyielding laws of physics and economics. Instead of a green utopia, Germany has found itself trapped in a structural nightmare. Electricity prices have surged to the highest levels in the developed world, forcing the legendary Mittelstand companies to freeze production or move overseas. The very industrial base that defined "Made in Germany" is now being dismantled by the cost of the power required to sustain it. As we peel back the layers of this systemic collapse, we see that this isn't just a story about bad luck or geopolitical shifts. It is a story about the danger of designing infrastructure based on ideology rather than engineering reality. Before we analyze how the world's fourth-largest economy drove itself toward a self-inflicted energy cliff, I invite you to join our community. Analyzing these complex systems requires a commitment to looking beneath the surface numbers. If you value investigative, data-driven deep dives into the mechanisms that shape our world, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Your support allows us to maintain the technical rigor these topics demand. By the end of this video, you will understand a concept the German government ignored for 20 years, the intermittency tax. We will demonstrate why, despite spending $500 billion, Germany is now forced to tear down forests for coal mines just to keep the lights from flickering. This is the autopsy of an energy miracle that became a systemic trap. To understand why the energy wind is failing, we must first understand the fundamental tension between industrial demand and intermittent supply. A modern power grid is not a warehouse. It is a real-time balancing act where generation must match consumption down to the millisecond. For a century, the German system was anchored by baseload power, massive nuclear and coal plants that provided a constant, high-voltage foundation. This stability was the silent partner of German industry, allowing chemical giants and automotive assembly lines to operate with absolute precision. However, the transition to wind and solar introduced a radical new variable, volatility. When you replace a predictable, synchronized turbine with a weather-dependent source, you create what engineers call the stability gap. Germany's mistake was not in building renewables, but in believing that these sources could replace foundational infrastructure without a viable, massive-scale storage solution that does not yet exist. This created a dual-system requirement. To ensure the grid doesn't collapse on a windless day, Germany must pay to maintain a complete backup fleet of fossil fuel plants. This is the intermittency tax, a structural doubling of infrastructure costs that has made German energy fundamentally uncompetitive on the global stage. The prosperity of modern Germany was never an accident of geography. It was an achievement of engineering discipline centered on a specific energy pact. In the decades following the devastation of World War II, the West German economic miracle, or Wirtschaftswunder, was forged in the heat of heavy industry. This era was defined by a commitment to absolute energy reliability. Between 1955 and 1970, German industrial output did not merely grow, it tripled. This explosive expansion was physically tethered to the massive coal deposits of the Ruhr Valley and a strategic, state-backed pivot toward nuclear technology. By the 1970s, as global oil shocks paralyzed other Western economies, Germany doubled down on its nuclear program. The logic was simple. To compete globally with a high-wage workforce, the nation needed the lowest possible energy variance. Nuclear power provided a massive, carbon-free baseload that operated at a 90% capacity factor. It was the silent engine behind the success of the Mittelstand and the global dominance of chemical giants like BASF. These companies didn't just need electricity. They needed high-voltage, frequency-stable power that could sustain massive electrolytic processes and high-heat manufacturing 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. This foundation of iron and uranium created a sense of permanence that blinded policymakers to the fragility of the system they were about to dismantle. In 2011, following the Fukushima incident in Japan, the German government made a decision that defied technical logic in favor of political survival: the atomosting. In an instant, 17 nuclear reactors, representing over 20,000 megawatts of the world's most reliable power, were slated for termination. This was the moment the energy pact was broken. By removing the baseload floor, Germany essentially began to pull the foundation out from under its own industrial house while the roof was still being built. The assumption was that wind and solar could naturally fill the void, but this ignored the fundamental difference between energy and power. Energy is a quantity, but power is the rate of delivery. While Germany could build enough turbines to produce the same number of terawatt-hours as its nuclear plants, it could not replicate the constant, synchronized inertia that those massive spinning turbines provided to the grid. This pivot marked the transition from an era of calculated industrial planning to an era of systemic gambling, where the weather would determine the price of progress. To understand the economic decay of the German system, one must look at the merit order effect, a market mechanism that turned into a systemic trap. In a standard electricity market, power sources are ranked by their marginal cost of production. Because wind and solar have no fuel costs, their marginal cost is near zero, meaning they're always the first to be sold on the exchange. On a sunny, windy day, Germany is flooded with free energy, which collapses the wholesale price of electricity. On the surface, this looks like a triumph for the consumer, but beneath the numbers, it is a parasitic process. These periods of zero or even negative prices destroy the profitability of the very coal and gas plants that the grid requires for stability. Because these traditional plants cannot compete with free intermittent energy, they lose the capital necessary for maintenance and modernization. However, the moment the sun sets or the wind dies down, the free energy vanishes, and the grid must desperately call upon those same fossil fuel plants to ramp up. Because these plants have been financially starved by the merit order, they must charge exorbitant prices during these periods of scarcity to stay solvent. This creates a structural paradox where the more renewables Germany adds to its grid, the more expensive the total system becomes. This is the heart of the intermittency tax. The government is forced to subsidize the backup fleet to prevent them from closing entirely, while simultaneously subsidizing the expansion of renewables that are making the backup fleet unprofitable. The cost of this dual infrastructure overhead is passed directly to the industrial consumer. For a company like Volkswagen or ThyssenKrupp, energy costs are no longer a manageable variable, but a volatile threat. They are forced to pay for the wind turbines that don't always turn and the gas plants that only run half the time. This lack of price predictability is a death sentence for long-term capital investment. When the cost of a kilowatt-hour in Germany is 300% higher than in the United States or China, the outcome is mathematically certain. Capital begins to leak out of the country, seeking environments where the energy profile matches the requirements of heavy industry. Germany is not just losing energy sovereignty, it is cannibalizing the very economic surplus required to fund its green transition in the first place. The failure of the energy wind is as much a failure of geography as it is of policy. Germany's energy generation is increasingly concentrated in the north, where the winds of the Baltic and North Seas provide the most consistent output. However, the nation's industrial heartland, the massive manufacturing hubs of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg, sits in the south. This creates a massive physical imbalance. The existing high-voltage transmission lines were never designed to transport such vast quantities of power over hundreds of miles. As a result, When the northern wind farms are operating at peak capacity, the grid often lacks the pipeline to send that power to the southern factories. To prevent the northern lines from overheating and collapsing, grid operators are forced to perform a process known as redispatch. They must pay northern wind operators to shut down their turbines, essentially wasting carbon-free energy, while simultaneously paying gas and coal plants in the south to turn on and meet the local demand. The consumer pays for the energy that was never produced in the north, and again for the expensive fossil fuel energy produced in the south. The scale of this logistical failure is staggering. In the early 2000s, the German grid required fewer than 10 major interventions per year to maintain stability. Today, that number has surged to over 1,000 interventions annually. The costs associated with these interventions have exploded from roughly 50 million euros to over 4 billion euros per year. This is the ghost energy cost, a multi-billion euro penalty for a lack of infrastructure foresight. The solution, a massive north-to-south transmission project known as SuedLink, has been mired in bureaucratic delays and local opposition for over a decade. By the time it is completed, the industrial landscape it was meant to serve may no longer exist. This geographical bottleneck acts as a permanent friction on the German economy. It creates a localized energy inflation that hits the most productive sectors of society the hardest. Every time a turbine in the north is braked to save the grid, the structural inefficiency of the German model is laid bare. It is a system that produces plenty of energy where it isn't needed and almost none where it is, leaving the industrial south to survive on a precarious and expensive life support system of imported gas and emergency coal. The structural failure of the German energy transition was long masked by a geopolitical architecture that was as fragile as it was cynical. To bridge the gap between the intermittent nature of renewables and the constant demand of heavy industry, German policymakers relied on a singular, massive crutch: cheap Russian natural gas. This was the unholy alliance of the energy wind. While the world was shown images of wind turbines and solar panels, the reality was that Germany was building an entire energy regime on the assumption that the pipelines from the east would never run dry. Natural gas was marketed as the bridge technology, a flexible fuel that could be fired up in minutes to compensate for a sudden drop in wind speed. Because Russian gas was significantly cheaper than LNG or domestic alternatives, it allowed Germany to maintain a veneer of industrial competitiveness despite its mounting intermittency tax. The Nord Stream pipelines were not just infrastructure. They were the life support system for a nation that had voluntarily amputated its own nuclear legs. When these pipelines were severed in 2022, the bridge did not just crack, it vanished, leaving the German economy suspended over a $500 billion abyss. The consequences of this reliance were immediate and systemic. Without the buffer of cheap gas, the true cost of an intermittent grid was suddenly exposed to the raw forces of the global market. Germany was forced to compete for liquid natural gas on the spot market, paying prices that were occasionally 10 times higher than those enjoyed by its industrial competitors in North America. This exposed a fundamental flaw in the German strategic design. Sovereignty cannot be built on a foundation of imported dependency. By choosing to eliminate nuclear power, a domestic, high-density energy source, Germany had effectively outsourced its industrial stability to a geopolitical rival. This stability gap that we discussed earlier was no longer just a technical challenge for grid operators. It became a national security crisis. Every chemical plant and steel mill in the country was suddenly forced to confront a reality where energy was no longer a guaranteed utility, but a scarce and prohibitively expensive luxury. The bridge was gone, and the German system was left with a choice between total grid collapse or a desperate, expensive scramble for the very fossil fuels it had promised to leave behind. We are now witnessing the beginning of what economists call structural deindustrialization. This is not a temporary recession, but a permanent relocation of the productive forces that made Germany a global power. For a century, The German model relied on the ability to import raw materials and export high-value finished goods. But that model requires a price floor for energy that has now been permanently raised. When energy costs represent 20 to 30% of the total production cost for sectors like chemicals, glass, and metals, a 300% increase in electricity prices is a mathematical eviction notice. The world's largest chemical complex, BASF's headquarters in Ludwigshafen, is the canary in the coal mine. This massive site, which consumes as much electricity as a small nation, has been forced to shut down its ammonia and fertilizer plants, opting instead to invest billions in new facilities in China and the United States. This is the capital leak, a systemic flow of wealth away from the German energy trap. When companies like BASF or Volkswagen move their core manufacturing abroad, they don't just take their profits. They take the entire ecosystem of suppliers, engineers, and tax revenue that sustains the German social contract. The tragedy of this exodus is that it is driven by the very intermittency tax that the energy wind created. Industrial giants cannot operate on a maybe energy schedule. They require a level of voltage stability that intermittent grid struggles to provide without massive, redundant costs. As the industrial base shrinks, the burden of maintaining the expensive grid infrastructure falls on a smaller number of consumers, further driving up prices in a destructive feedback loop. Small and medium-sized enterprises, the legendary middle stand, are finding that their decades-old business models are no longer viable. They lack the capital to relocate like BASF, but they also lack the margins to absorb the highest energy prices in Europe. We are seeing a quiet liquidation of the German middle class's industrial heritage. Every factory that closes in the Ruhr Valley is a physical manifestation of a policy that prioritized ideological purity over thermodynamic reality. The Made in Germany brand was built on the reliability of the German machine. But even the finest machine cannot run without the fuel to turn its gears. The final irony of the energy wind is its environmental cost. In its desperate attempt to maintain grid stability after abandoning nuclear power and losing Russian gas, Germany has been forced to return to its dirtiest legacy, lignite, or brown coal. This is the most carbon-intensive form of energy generation, yet has become the essential backstop for the German grid. To keep the lights on during the Dunkelflaut, periods of low sun and low wind, Germany has been forced to expand its massive open-pit coal mines. This has led to the surreal spectacle of a green government authorizing the demolition of ancient forests and entire villages, like Lützerath, to reach the coal seams beneath them. The very nation that preached the end of fossil fuels is now operating some of the highest emitting power plants in the European Union. This is the Lignite Paradox. By removing the clean, stable base load of nuclear energy, Germany made itself structurally dependent on the dirtiest fuel available to prevent a total blackout. The data reveals the scale of this regression. In peak winter months, coal has surged to provide over one-third of Germany's total electricity generation. This isn't a temporary measure. It is a structural necessity of a grid that lacks storage. Because wind and solar cannot be ramped up on command, the grid must have a shadow system of coal and gas ready to fire at any moment. This redundant infrastructure is not only expensive, but environmentally devastating. The carbon footprint of the German grid remains significantly higher than that of nuclear-heavy France, despite Germany spending hundreds of billions more on renewables. The energy wind has created a system that is both the most expensive and, at times, the most polluting in the developed world. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when a transition is managed by decree rather than by engineering. The removal of the nuclear floor did not lead to a green paradise. It led to a world where ancient villages are swallowed by giant excavators to fuel the backup generators of a failing dream. What we are witnessing in Germany is not a series of isolated policy errors, but the emergence of a self-reinforcing feedback loop of systemic entropy. The $500 billion investment in the energy wind has reached a point of diminishing returns where every additional wind turbine or solar panel added to the grid actually increases the total system cost and decreases overall stability. This is the ultimate expression of the intermittency tax. As the share of volatile renewables grows, the complexity of managing the grid scales exponentially, not linearly. We see this in the surge of grid interventions, from 10 a year to over 1,000. Each intervention is a micro-failure of the system's design, requiring expensive, carbon-heavy compensation. The physics of the grid demand a level of synchronization that weather-dependent energy simply cannot provide without a massive and currently non-existent storage buffer. By forcing this transition before the technology was ready, Germany has locked itself into a high-cost, high-volatility regime that is fundamentally incompatible with the requirements of a first-tier industrial power. This energy profile creates a secondary, economic feedback loop. As electricity prices remain structural outliers, often 300% higher than global competitors, the industrial base that generates the tax revenue to fund green subsidies begins to evaporate. This is the capital leak we discussed. When the chemical and automotive sectors move their production to the United States or China, they take the nation's economic surplus with them. This leaves a smaller, less productive economy to shoulder the massive, ongoing costs of the dual infrastructure grid. Germany is essentially trying to pay for a 21st century energy experiment with a 19th century industrial output. The result is a shrinking GDP and a mounting debt burden, as the state is forced to step in with hundreds of billions in emergency subsidies to keep household prices from triggering a total social collapse. The system is no longer moving toward a green equilibrium. It is spinning toward a structural breakdown where the cost of energy destroys the wealth needed to transform the energy system. I am not explaining what might happen. I am explaining why these systems always behave this way when ideology attempts to override the thermal and economic limits of the physical world. The story of Germany's $500 billion mistake is a cautionary tale for the global transition. It serves as a stark reminder that energy is the master resource. It determines the complexity and the survival of every other system in a civilization. By decoupling its industrial heart from the iron foundation of stable baseload power, Germany has effectively resigned from its position as the economic engine of Europe. The sick man of Europe has returned, not because of a lack of labor or a lack of talent, but because it has made the physical act of manufacturing too expensive to sustain. The lesson is clear: a green transition that ignores the necessity of firm, reliable power, whether through nuclear energy or long-duration storage, is not a transition at all, but a managed decline. The German experiment has proven that you cannot run a high-voltage society on a low-density, intermittent profile without incurring costs that eventually cannibalize the society itself. As other nations look to replicate parts of the German model, they must confront the data we have explored today. They must account for the intermittency tax, the Redispatch Crisis, and the Lignite Paradox. To ignore these factors is to invite the same structural trap that now paralyzes the German state. If you found this deep dive into the engineering and economic reality of the energy transition valuable, please ensure you are subscribed and have liked the video. Your engagement helps us continue to produce these high-fidelity investigations into the systems that govern our lives. We have only begun to scratch the surface of how the quest for energy sovereignty can lead to systemic vulnerability if the laws of physics are treated as secondary to political will. Germany's path back to stability will be long, expensive, and likely involve a painful return to the technologies it once discarded in a moment of panic. The numbers do not lie, and the infrastructure does not care about intentions. See you in the next video.